Welcome to the Ask Historians podcast.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Ask Historian podcast. I am your host, Morgan Lewin, one of the moderators over Ask Historians, writing under the username A Quarterman. Joining me today is Dr. Claire Aubin. She is a historian of Holocaust perpetrators in the United States with a PhD from the University of Edinburgh. Her research focuses on themes of community, violence, and justice in the context of the post-war period. Welcome, Claire.
Hi, thank you for having me.
It's always a pleasure to have you. Welcome back, and
Yes, you
congratulations, many congratulations on recently earning your PhD.
Thank you very much. I should have said thank you for having me again, but yes, thank you.
Yeah, it's been a while. It's been like 2 years since the last time we did this. Time flies when you are having a post-pandemic life. So our topic today is going to be a bit different from some of the things that we usually do on the podcast. We are going to be talking about current issues and challenges facing historians in contemporary times, instead of necessarily talking about a specific historical issue. But we felt like it was interesting and it was a good moment in time to talk about these things because of the fact that the world is a very convoluted place these days, and history can have the power to help in some ways, but only if we actually look inwards into our discipline and actually address some of the challenges that we will be talking about today. And one of the first things we were discussing prior to starting the recording was accessibility in writing history. So do you want to give us some of your thoughts when it comes to looking at the different ways in which we can better engage with the public as historians and not necessarily just as academics?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's an issue within, or sort of a disconnection that happens within the world of academic history, where academic historians work on a topic, especially something that matters very deeply to the world and to our understanding of the world, and want to put it out into the world. And they write it, and then they're confused about why their writing is getting no traction, or about why no one is reading their work, or about why it's not more widely understood if they've already put it out into the world. And the answer is that it's not written for people who aren't academics. It's written for academics. And, you know, that writing, it's a very specific style of writing that happens. And if you're writing academic history, it's very formal. It's written in, you know, often highly intellectual sort of style, a highly intellectualized style of writing, which is great sometimes, but it's not great if you want a public who's not familiar with that style of writing, or who isn't comfortable reading that kind of stuff, because very often it relies on context and historical context that your reader does not have access to. If your writing requires that your reader knows absolutely everything there is to know about this topic already, and that you're just updating them on some small sort of niche element of a story, you're going to cut out the vast majority of readers in the world. And some academics like that and want that. Some academics write because they do only want other academics to read them, and that's fine. That's a totally acceptable approach. However, if you do that, you can't then get angry that more people don't know about your writing or about your work, or that more people don't understand an aspect of history that you are an expert on, because your writing is not written for them. Your writing is not for other people. It's for you and for your sort of small circle of readers. So yeah, I mean, making sure that your writing, it doesn't rely so heavily on context that exists out with your writing is really deeply important. Or if it does, then you give them that context. Make sure that your reader knows what you're talking about, knows where your information's coming from, knows which theorists you're pulling work from and why, and what their theories mean, rather than just, you know, referring to them and moving past it. Like, that's a thing that a lot of people find really inaccessible about writing or about reading academic writing is they feel like it draws from all of these other thinkers and other authors without any real thorough explanation of the information that it's drawing from, with sort of those pools of information. So that's kind of one of my main things. I want everybody to be able to read my writing. I want everybody to be able to understand it or to hear me speak or whatever it is in a way that they feel like they will then be able to process it and learn it and absorb it and go out into the world with that sort of information. We talked a little bit about how right now, because I just like 2 months ago finished my PhD, I'm in the process of turning my dissertation into a book to go up for sale later this year. One of the things that's been really interesting is deciding that I wanted to find a style of writing that is both good and useful for academics, but is still with a very serious trade publisher so that anyone can read it. And so finding a style of writing that fits both of those is kind of not necessarily difficult, but it's a challenge for sure, in a way that I wasn't expecting it necessarily to be. But I think it's important and it's worth doing.
I agree, and I think that there's something interesting that you brought up, that you said that you want your writing to be able to be read by everyone. So I think that's a very important question that historians should start asking themselves and ourselves more often. Who am I doing this for? Who am I actually writing this for? What is the purpose of this research? Because among the humanities, history is one of the most difficult to justify in terms of practicality for a multitude of reasons. Probably first and foremost because our object of study is dead, it's gone. The past is not real, there is no such thing as the past. uh, Sociologists will study, real societies that actually exist. Psychologists will actually study human minds that are very much real. The past is not real, and the uses and the practical applications of history can be difficult to pinpoint sometimes. But it has its uses, it has its real life applications. But the thing is, if we want to analyze and if we want to look at history in a way that allows us um, to contribute in some way to which is what scientific disciplines are supposed to do, to contribute to the betterment of humanity in some way. Well, what is this humanity that I'm talking about? Who are these people? Why am I trying to engage with a certain amount of people or with a certain demographic and not with a different one? What is my target audience? Because it is very much writing. I think that a lot of historians look at history as just a scientific discipline, but it's also very much writing narratives. That is what we do. Historians write narratives. We're not like economists trying to come up with random explanations for things. We actually interpret sources and write narratives based on those. And making history accessible is obviously the core principle and mission of Ask Historians. That is why Ask Historians exist and why those of us who contribute to it continue to do it, because we believe in the need for history to be a readily accessible discipline, not just an academic one in the strictest sense. But we also need to be very wary, and we also need to be very careful in analyzing when it comes to looking at these accessibility concerns, um, how we handle some of the most delicate subjects, because some historians study uh, very general things, or some historians study things that happened hundreds, thousands of years ago, and that's perfectly fine. Some of us study things that are much more recent and that are much more intertwined with sufferings that are still uh, being felt, with wounds that are still very much a part of everyday life for a lot of people. You study Holocaust perpetrators in the States, uh, and that is very much something that is still a part of everyday life for a lot of people. Like Obviously, there are less and less survivors of the Holocaust who are still alive, for obvious reasons. It was it was a long time ago at this point, but at the same time, it wasn't that long ago. When it comes to looking at the consequences of living and coexisting with those people, with the like, a lot of survivors of the Holocaust fled to the U.S. and a lot of survivors of the Holocaust fled here to Argentina, just as a lot of Holocaust perpetrators fled to both of our respective countries. I was in the Holocaust Museum in Buenos Aires a couple of weeks ago. I hadn't been there for many years, and they've done a wonderful job of just reforming the entire place. And it's truly a wonderful experience, but also a very tough one if you're Jewish like me. Um, but there is an entire section dedicated specifically to Nazi perpetrators in Argentina. Um, because obviously we had some of the most famous ones, because Mengele lived here for a while, and obviously Eichmann ended up being found here by the Mossad. Um, but there were many others who just they don't necessarily make it to Wikipedia, or they don't necessarily make it to the popular consciousness, who very much lived right next to Jewish families, in some cases right next to Holocaust survivors. And these are things that are sometimes can be very difficult um, to make interesting to read, while also remaining respectful to the very real implications and the very real wounds that the subjects that we are looking at can can have on the lives of people today. Because I tend to study things related to the last military dictatorship here in Argentina in the late 70s and early 80s. Um, and it can be difficult even for me. My grandfather was kidnapped and tortured by the military because he was a union activist. Um, Union activists ended up being the majority of the people disappeared and by the military. Um, so I guess that the what I'm really thinking about, and what I'm asking is, how do you think that we can maintain a balance between the interestingness, I suppose, if that's even a word, that we need to convey in order for a writing to become accessible for the majority of people who are not familiar with the strictest sides of history as an academic discipline, and the respectfulness that we have a responsibility to maintain when it comes to dealing with these issues.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a good question. It's something that a lot of historians really struggle with, um, myself included. Um, I mean, we talked about this last time I was on the podcast, but with emotionally demanding histories group, that's a topic of conversation we've had in that group. Um, because finding the balance between sort of sensationalization and very straightforward historical discussion can be difficult if you're trying to have an audience who's engaged with your work. Um, and there's no real easy or good answer necessarily, just like everything else. But I think it's about making sure that you have a set of ethical boundaries as a historian. Um, in terms of what kind of things you will and will not talk about when you're talking about them, where you're talking about them. Um, for example, in my work, I avoid extremely graphic descriptions of violence unless it's pertinent to the topic at hand, which sounds kind of like a no-brainer, but in actuality, like if you're talking about Holocaust perpetrators, right, and you need to contextualize the violence that they committed and why that matters to them coming to the US, I don't want to go out of my way to discuss violence in an incredibly graphic way, which a lot of authors do, for emphasis. Like they'll do it just for the sake of saying it or to get as a hook for people. And I don't think, at least for my ethics, and everybody's ethical boundaries and guidelines differ, but ethically to me, that feels like exploitation of violence rather than the use of it to explain some other event or series of events or something else. I don't think it's worth discussing violence for the sake of violence itself. However, if I'm talking about, for example, a perpetrator that I discuss a lot, Hermina Braunstein-Orion, when she lived in the US, and was discovered in the 60s, one of the ways that people would defend her neighbors in particular would defend her was by saying, oh, she's such a good person, she was such a great person, she loved my dog, she got on so well with my dogs, and all these things. Like, who could how could she be a Nazi? How could she have been a perpetrator of the Holocaust if she, if dogs love her, right? And in actuality, like, then an example of when I would talk about violence is, when she was a concentration camp guard, one of her duties was as a dog handler. Like, so, and describing how she would set dogs on camp prisoners. And so this thing where we talk about violence is making sure, or talking about things that are graphic or difficult or whatever, is making sure that they have a purpose. You're not just saying it for the sake of saying it because you want it to hook readers in. You're saying it because it matters to the story that you're telling. If you're telling a story just about violence or just about something sad or traumatic or whatever, sure, sometimes you might describe it, in a little bit of detail where those details matter. But I think the difficulty is they're very often, I think it's being phased out, but I think there are still very often authors or historians, particularly sort of more popular historians rather than ones who are academic historians, who will rely so heavily on depictions of violence or trauma or pain or whatever, to ensure readership that they lose the point of what they're writing. It becomes a story of fascination rather than one of some greater historical importance, or one that teaches a lesson, right? It's very often that the purpose of writing history, because not just that you want to teach people this event happened, but here are the effects of this event. Here's what it means in a broader context. Here's what it means to the world. Here's what it means to a community. All those kinds of things that are like, there's a purpose beyond just the description of an event or a person or a place, and when you become so entrenched in discussions of really graphic violence or pain or whatever, you lose that. You lose the lesson, other than the lesson being don't do bad stuff, because that's not really a lesson. You learn that from when you're a baby. Like, it's not that. And it gets that it's bigger than that. And that gets lost when you focus so heavily on this sensationalized aspect of your work. Even though that is the easiest way to get people to look at it.
I agree, and I was, while you were talking about this particular Holocaust perpetrator, I was reminded of obviously of Hannah Arendt, because I think that's something that can happen a lot to historians, especially historians who deal with war history or military history, or genocide history, who end up appealing so much to these very, like you said, these overly graphic depictions of violence. Um, they can, even though I understand from from an industrial perspective, let's call it, from a very capitalistic perspective, it is understandable, because yes, uh, there is a reason why the overwhelming majority of the questions we get asked and asked historians are related to wars. Uh, so many of them are about the Second World War, but there's just pretty much every other war, especially the wars of the 20th century, because they attract a certain kind of fascination. Like the we have so many video games about wars, so many movies about wars, from any perspective. Like we can see a lot of popular media and also popular history that both condemns these things, that can sometimes endorse these extremely violent instances in history. But at the end of the day, I was reminded of Hannah Arendt, because there comes a point in which these excessive depictions of violence end up banalizing the fact that behind the individuals perpetrating these crimes, there is a political system, there is an economic system. One of the things that at least I personally have always found most helpful of Arendt's works, particularly, of course, Eichmann in Jerusalem, uh, is not necessarily the idea that these people weren't monsters. That much is not, I'm not a philosopher, so that's not my interest. But the idea that there was a political machine and an economic machine functioning behind these things, it's something that we have to deal with a lot when it comes to looking at indigenous studies, particularly down here in the south, because the colonization process was very different between North and South, between the Spanish and Portuguese, and the French and the English. Um, so the process of genociding and of colonizing and absorbing indigenous cultures was very, very, very different between the North and the South in the Americas. But at the end of the day, even though the process and the means by which this genocide was carried out, um, the goals were very much the same. They were economic and political. They were expansionism. They were domination by means of a fake belief on the civilization mission. That at the end of the day was just different economic systems, mercantilism in the case of the Spanish and the Portuguese, capitalism in the case of the English and the French, but they were just looking for expansion. They were just looking for more resources, and they were obviously interested in exterminating everything that they deemed inferior to them. But a lot of the time, when we look at indigenous issues, we end up seeing these overly graphic descriptions and depictions of like the demographic catastrophe, disease, uh, especially when it comes to the early colonization of the Americas, because it was at the very beginning, it was a very straightforward process of just political domination through military strategizing. But a lot of people look at, I don't know, say popular work. Well, we were actually talking about this. GGS, Guns, Germs, and Steel, which is it's a contentious book. So much so that if you go to the Ask Historians frequent to ask questions section, we have an entire section dedicated to that book alone, and to why we don't like that book. But those types of popular history end up just constricting and minimizing and just reducing. There is a very powerful reductionism present in these types of histories that just looks at processes that were hundreds of years long, or even at a smaller scale, years, decades long, with that had incredible complexities, and they just reduced them to something banal, to something just, it was just a lot of violence for violence's sake, and that is very much not the case. The colonizations and conquest of the Americans was not just for violence's sake. It wasn't just because Europeans thought that indigenous peoples were inferior. It wasn't just that. In the same way as the Holocaust wasn't just because one of the questions that we get asked so much in Ask Historians, that I think we actually have a podcast episode from a few years back about that question itself, is did Hitler actually believe everything that they said about the Jews and the Roma and disabled people and everybody who was killed in the Holocaust? And I'm not saying it's not a valid question. I'm not saying it's not, because it is a valid question and it can prompt a very accessible and very open discussion. But that's not really the point,
Yeah.
is it?
It's not really material to what happened, whether
exactly
he didn't believe in it. He did it as a means to an end. Also, there's so much more there. I get it. People are curious, but it also is this same reductionism thing you're talking about, where it's just reducing it to the beliefs of an individual that really, I mean, it's not, I don't want to say it doesn't matter, because I guess it does in terms of like what he believed or didn't believe, but it's that that's not really what matters. That's not the most important thing in all of this. And it does very often get, I've gotten that question before too. And it's sort of like, sure, we could talk about this, but there's a lot more to it than that, and a lot more important things to it than that. So yeah, I can understand why you would feel like frustrated with hearing that all the time, because it's something that people want to talk about, and sure, but yeah, I think you're absolutely right to treat it as an access point to much more important, much more useful discussions about the Holocaust, um, and destruction of so many other people in Europe and sort of in Northern Africa. It's really, yeah. There's a lot more to it. There's a lot more to it, and
Absolutely, absolutely. But it can be useful, like you said, to just use these types of questions to also address another thing that can be a good segue into our next topic, that was obviously fascism, um, which is, I think, personally at least, I think that one of the things that leads to these types of overly present interest in these individuals is the very real heritage that the great man theory left behind,
Mhm.
uh, which to any listeners who might not be entirely familiar with the concept, it's a bit self-explanatory. It's the idea that ended up developing in the 17th century and 18th century, in the earliest ages of history as a discipline, that of course history was made by individuals, by specific great men, obviously white male European men, of course, because what is everybody else? Who cares about anybody
The
else, right?
prerequisite to being great, you
Yeah,
know.
I know. Which is why I will never be great, because I'm not one of those things. Uh, um, but that is still very much present these days. Like there is still, I don't know. I'm thinking of people looking at the recent conversations when it comes to the U.S. founding fathers owning slaves, right?
Mhm.
And how well, but they didn't like it. Everybody else, every other slave owner is bad, but this group of men whose faces are in a mountain, they're okay because they actually didn't really enjoy owning slaves. You know what I mean? Because these individuals, the same with Hitler or Mussolini or Franco in Spain, um, these individuals end up awakening a sort of fascination in a lot of people in the popular consciousness, because throughout the 20th century and a substantial chunk of the 21st century, we as historians have actually given them a lot of relevance as
Mhm.
individuals. As like we think of Nazi Germany and we think of Hitler, and that's pretty much it. Like, sure, we might, if you look into it a bit more and you're more interested, you might look and think Goebbels, you might think Himmler, and that's about it.
Yeah.
But the entire machine of Nazi Germany was so much more than one Austrian guy. You know, there was so much more to the industrialization of murder on a massive scale and of discrimination on a massive scale. That wasn't just the beliefs of one individual person. It was like, I don't know, Mercedes Benz and Volkswagen and
Mhm.
Hugo Boss and a lot of captains of industry and corporations that benefited enormously from the Holocaust and
Mhm.
that are still very much kicking today. Um, there is an entire history of anti-Semitism in the region that isn't just created with Mein Kampf. Like there
Yeah.
are so many things that we can extrapolate from these types of questions that can be useful, especially these days when we have such a massive alt-right and far-right issue that is the Western world is seeing just more and more of constantly. Um,
Mhm.
so there you go. Thoughts on on today's.
Yeah. Well, I
Uh,
mean, one of the things, I mean, I'll get there in one second. But one of the things that really struck me about that is a few years ago, 2019. So, well, yeah, end of 2019. So, right before the pandemic hit, I got an email from a producer for a documentary that was going to be on Netflix. and they asked me, or documentary series, and they were looking for historians who would go to Poland with them and do this documentary. They didn't really give me that much information. They said that they found me on a Women Also Know History website, and they wanted, someone who worked on the Holocaust. And I was like, okay, sure, yeah. And then we scheduled this meeting, and at the meeting, they were like, great, so you're an expert on Himmler. And I was like, well, I'm not. And they were like, okay, so can you talk to us about Himmler? And I was like, no. And they were like, and I was like, well, what do you want me to say? Like, what's the goal here? And they were like, well, you said you research Holocaust perpetration. I said, yes, I do. And here are the specific aspects that I research on. I actually particularly focus on ones who moved to the US. I would be better at talking about Holocaust perpetration on a lower level in terms of like individuals, like small men, not great men in this context. And I would be better at talking about that for you, or talking about the Holocaust in the US, because that's mostly what I work on. And they were like, well, why would we want a documentary about that? And I was like, and I don't think it ever actually ended up getting made because there was the pandemic and people couldn't travel to Poland for this thing. But I mean, it was just like this complete misunderstanding. These people who had this huge platform and were able to talk about whatever they wanted to and make this documentary, were like, well, what do you mean you are a historian who works on the Holocaust and doesn't exclusively focus on Himmler? And it was a very strange experience. But it's really common that, and it's because I think you're totally right. There's this interest specifically in individuals, especially high-ranking individuals in any case, not just the Holocaust, but in any sort of period of history, that leads to these like self-perpetuating beliefs about how atrocity or total cultural domination or whatever happens, that are just so, I think, not useful ultimately, because the sure, someone provides a motivation for something or provides inspiration for something, or things are done in the name of them, but they're not the ones, driving the tractors. They're not the ones making things happen on a day-to-day basis on an individual level. And when there's an obsession with the founding fathers, you turn the issue of slavery into a discussion of, as horrifying as this is to say, good enslavers, the founding fathers, according to some people, which I think a good enslaver does not exist, in my opinion. For some people, they find a way to square that circle. But you create this dichotomy between good enslavers and bad enslavers, and the good ones are the ones who had enslaved people, but didn't feel good about it, but felt kind of bad about it. And I think it's also pretty debatable when you talk about, for example, Jefferson having Sally having in a windowless room attached to his bedroom and keeping her there for her whole life, pretty much. Like, that's how do you can't square that. And it's a real, two people who are on, for example, the alt-right or who have fascist leanings, that feels like an attack on their ideology as well, because as soon as you start to say, hey, actually, maybe we should move away from an ideological, one ideological viewpoint, or away from great man theory or whatever, it brings everything else into question. As soon as you say we should re-envision the way that we look at the world or the way that we look at history, that feels like a direct attack on their ideology and puts you kind of in their crosshairs. And also then, because people feel threatened by this idea that we should be looking at history from another angle, they feel threatened by that, and they're able to very quickly mobilize other people in this threatened, they're coming for us, they're taking what we have, what we've stolen, they're taking it back for themselves, they being this sort of amorphous inimical figure, any enemy is that. And then the movement grows. Like it's something that grows out of, I think, whether obviously misguided or not, but this a real genuine fear that a group will lose power or will lose access to power, and as soon as you threaten that in any way, that movement is able to gain traction and gain steam, because people feel genuinely threatened by your reframing of history in a way that does not paint them in a positive light. People don't like discussing founding fathers because they identify with them in some way or another. They identify as a patriot, as a man who wants to bring the US to glory. Like they feel the existence of the founding father is a fundamental part of their identity as an individual. And when you challenge that in any way, just by saying maybe those guys weren't as good as we've painted them out to be in the past, as soon as you challenge that, you are challenging their identity as an individual, and you're challenging something that is core to their understanding of themselves and of the world. And I think that the solution is honestly that historians should keep doing it, not back off, which is what a lot of historians, sometimes it gets too hot. They feel it's too much and they back away from it. And ultimately that does damage, like that allows these sort of violent or hurtful or whatever movements to continue growing. It just fuels them if they feel like they're succeeding when they say, hey, you're threatening us, so we'll threaten you back, when what you've done to threaten them is simply say, maybe there's another way to look at this moment in history, or maybe we should look at this moment in history a little bit more holistically rather than by venerating individuals. Like that's all you have to do for someone to feel deeply threatened by you as a historian or by your new form of history or whatever, if you look at like the 1619 project, for example, which there are some historians have issues with other parts of that, but just the fact that they were willing to say, hey, let's reimagine the boundaries of slavery in the United States, of chattel slavery in the United States, was like enough to make people's heads explode. And like that was just by saying, let's move the dates back a bit. Let's say when this actually started, and that was enough. Like that was enough to make the world kind of spin off its axis for a lot of people, So.
Yeah, it was enough to get the U.S. president at the time to denounce it. Regardless of who the U.S. president at the time was, it doesn't really matter to this particular conversation. Mm-hmm. It's the fact that someone, like you said, that like individuals can become so aggressively threatened by these types of re-examinations of history, that it can lead even people who are supposed to be above all of those things, because of the station that they occupy or the office that they are currently holding, to just completely go haywire because of something as basic or as essentially unremarkable for the national identity of a country, because it is honestly very, very, like the even if I'm not from the US, like the 1619 project, it's not something that should fundamentally change anything about the national identity or the individual's identity of Americans. It's just a different way of approaching the legacy and the heritage of slavery as a part of the history of the US. But the history of the US doesn't make or shouldn't make someone's national identity. That's like me saying that German people are still all Nazis, just because Germany was the seat of Nazi Germany and the Third Reich. That is ridiculous. That is absolutely ridiculous. But it is. But I think that it is very, very closely tied and closely related to something that we discussed before recording, which is journalism and the media, and people who like to either downplay or exaggerate current political events and the prevalence of certain political ideologies, um, for just economic gain, honestly, without actually having any sort of understanding of history itself like, properly. From both sides, we get like a lot of people downplaying or outright denying things like the Holocaust, the Armenian genocide, obviously the genocide of indigenous peoples in the Americas. Here in Argentina, we have a lot of people in the media, especially right wing media, but in the media in general, trying to downplay the atrocities committed by the military during during the entirety of the 20th century, because we had 6 different military dictatorships, but particularly the last one. Um, and I think that it is very much a time in which historians should be, again, asking ourselves, well, why am I doing this for? What is the point of any of what I'm doing? If people are actually believing that history happened in a specific way because that's what's written on this article or in this op-ed, instead of actually engaging with historical writings, instead of actually engaging with secondary sources, with my own work. You don't even have to go as far as to say, well, why aren't people reading, I don't know, this and that historian from like 50 years ago? Why aren't people engaging with what I have to say about this? In a lot of ways, it can probably be because it's not as interesting. It's just not as interesting, but it is necessary. It is a responsibility that I think historians have more and more to engage with the public. I'm not saying every historian should be a public historian. Not everyone likes that. Not everyone is good at it. Being a public historian is not easy. And we are probably going to be touching about on that in a little while when we talk about social media and
Yeah.
exposure. Um, but being a public historian can be a complicated career path, or just an aside to your career, because it's not your entire career, but it can be an aside of what you're doing. Um, but I do personally think that it is a responsibility that historians have, because simply because there's so much misinformation. Like, it is. I thought that the age of fake news like hit its peak in like 2015, and I was so wrong. I
Mm-hmm.
was so wrong. Um, but we are currently facing like impressive levels of intolerance.
Mm-hmm.
That sure they did exist. They've always existed. Like, intolerance and hatefulness have never gone away. It's nothing new. Neo Nazis showed up right after the Nuremberg trials. It's not a new thing.
Mm-hmm.
Ultra nationalism is not a new thing. Islamophobia, transphobia, sexism, misogyny—they're not new in
Mm-hmm.
the slightest, but they are very much at an all-time high. Um, and I believe that part of our accessibility challenge has to do with actually engaging with these things. And like you say, I absolutely agree with you. Not backing away from this, not running away from these conversations, which can be difficult to have. It can be scary sometimes, even. Uh, but it's important that we continue to do it, because who else is going to do it?
Yeah, I mean, I think um, the issue I'm seeing at the moment is not even necessarily like, how do I explain this? When I was finishing my PhD, they would have classes because academia is falling apart, and they would have these classes being like, "Here's what you could do outside of academia. Here's some jobs you could do with as a historian," which is
Right.
a fair and useful thing. Historians should be able to do other things, and not everyone wants to go into academia. For example, me. However, um, one of the things I said is like, historians should just be a journalist. And sure, you absolutely, people can and should if that's a career path that they want to pursue. And I don't think the issue is necessarily just historians becoming journalists. It's this weird thing that I've noticed, people that I colleagues with have noticed, which is now journalists rebranding as historians because there haven't been enough historians who are functioning in the way that they need to in terms of public engagement. There are not enough historians doing the work that they should, honestly, I truly believe they should be doing, of making their work publicly accessible, whether it's through the occasional op-ed or an article or whatever. And I'm still fresh in the world of being a historian, fresh in this. I got a PhD 2 months ago. So, I'm not an expert. However, you see journalists all the time saying, well, no one's written the history of this that's accessible, I'm just going to do it. And they don't have the training that they need in order to critically analyze or evaluate sources. They don't have any theory training. They don't have any sort of important, really fundamental, basic level understanding of how to write and engage with historical concepts, particularly ones that are difficult and ones that are complex. They have none of that training. And so then they become the ones who become these pop historians without any understanding of what is necessary in order to be able to write good, factual, evidence-based, not sensationalized history. And it dilutes the field in a massive way, and it dilutes the facts also. The actual history becomes totally filled with this desire to just rebrand as a historian. And I don't think that the issue is journalists doing that. I think the issue is historians not filling that role the way that they should be. Because if that gap didn't exist, the wrong people wouldn't be filling it. It exists because historians aren't doing that enough. And we say that over and over and over again, and everyone says it everywhere all the time. But people still aren't stepping up the way that they should, especially given the current slow, prolonged death of the academy. This is a viable path to being a historian and to putting your work into the world, and people just aren't doing it. And I think that's sad, and I think it's contributing to the issues that we've been talking about. If you're not going to fill the gap, journalists are going to, and they're going to do it worse than you. Sorry. I know that might sound really harsh. I think journalists I am friends with a lot of journalists. I think they do a wonderful service to the world. I think they're very important. I think the media is deeply important. It's important to my work as a historian, absolutely. But important for my work as evidence for things and as a source for things. It cannot just be history in and of itself. That's why historians matter, is to help interpret this information. Mm-hmm. They shouldn't just be replaced, and we're letting ourselves be replaced as a career by people who lack the training that academic historians have spent years and thousands of dollars or whatever currency you're using. You spent so much of their life dedicating themselves to, and then just rolling over and letting someone else do their job for them. And that, I think, is a huge problem. I mean, sorry, maybe it's a little bit of a rant, but I really feel like that's an issue.
Hey, that is what this episode has been. This entire episode has been two historians ranting.
Yeah. It's a problem in the field and it needs to change.
Yeah. But I do agree with you, and I do think that it is very much a part of the challenges that are facing historians and history as a discipline in general. And just so we can start wrapping this episode up, mm-hmm. I want to touch back on something that you mentioned, this idea of movements that keep growing out of people feeling threatened. Mm-hmm. And you have some very recent experience with exposure on social media that led to you interacting with a lot of these people. So I will cede the floor to you so you can tell us about that experience.
Yeah, I do. And it's so recent that it's still kind of ongoing. It happened a couple of days ago and it's still happening. But yeah, not that long ago, a few days ago, there was a meme going around Twitter, which happens to all the time. And this one had been ongoing. This wasn't a new meme, but it had been recently popularized by a philosopher, Daisy Dixon, who had posted a photo of herself looking beautiful and a photo of David Hume and said, what people think a philosopher looks like about David Hume and what a philosopher actually looks like about herself, which should be such an uncontroversial thing. She's well published. She has a lectureship at Cardiff. She's a philosopher, no question. and it just exploded. She got treated horribly. And then there were a bunch of people posting memes in solidarity, doing the same kind of thing. Like, what people think an electrician looks like, what I actually, like, anything. And I posted one that said, what people think a historian looks like, with a photo of Bede, very famous Middle Ages historian, wrote the Ecclesiastic History of the English People. Pretty famous. Old man monk with a tonsure and a beard and wearing a monk habit. That's the vibe. Wood. It's an engraving. And then a photo of me dressed in a formal dress for a historian's 30th birthday, actually, at an event full of historians. And it's just a photo of me, and I said what people think historians look like about Bede, and then what historians look like about me, and it exploded, like, in a way that I was not expecting, because I'd seen a ton of other people post things, and they didn't draw the same kind of insanity as I did, Daisy and I did. Honestly, a couple other people got a little bit of it, but she and I think, really bore the brunt of this huge backlash for being women who dared to call ourselves experts in something in the humanities. And when I say backlash, like, I don't mean people were kind of like a little rude to me. I mean, thousands of replies on both my post and on screenshots of my post that were floating around Twitter, quote tweets calling me just the most disgusting things imaginable, fantasizing about me, theorizing about what I did to earn my degree, saying I was a fake historian, saying I was lying, saying I didn't have any credentials, like, all of these things that were, like, just unbelievable. And one of the main things was this belief that I must be a historical revisionist, as though all of history isn't revision, but, like, we can talk about that another time, but, like, that is what history is, but fine. And, just these things that were just imagining a version of me that didn't exist, that were talking about my partners, my sexual history, my friends, the fact that I must have bought my degree, just everything. There was, like, this huge amount of scrutiny on me and on what they believed I must have done to become a historian, because there was just no way I could be a historian. Or this discussion of how history as a discipline must have declined. The history must have just imploded so far and so deeply in order for me, someone like me, to become a historian. And it was, like, pretty horrifying, like, because I thought it was such an innocuous, innocent thing to post. I have a PhD from the University of Edinburgh. I wrote a history of Holocaust perpetrators in the US. I thought it was just an uncontroversial thing to say I'm a historian, because I am. I've been on the Ask Historians podcast. I've been on History Hack. I've talked at the FDR library. Like, I've, like, done a talk at Oxford. Like, I am a historian. But that's not the point. The point is just that they wanted to make sure that I was aware that my existence as a historian was threatening to them as an individual, because it threatened their ideological belief in who was allowed to be experts on in my case, history, and in Daisy's case, philosophy. This thing that only certain people are allowed to exist in this discipline, and if you have the temerity to call yourself a member of this discipline or a part of this field, then you needed to be informed immediately that you didn't deserve to be there, and that there is something that is fundamentally flawed in you, that would cause you to have that belief about yourself, regardless of what evidence there is proving that, regardless of the supervisors that I had who are historians and the examiners, two of which were fairly significant historians in their own right, who sat at my viva and told me that I deserved a no corrections PhD, like, which is rare and I feel great about. Beyond all of those things, that doesn't matter. What matters is that they created a reality for themselves about what a historian is allowed to be. And I didn't fit that reality. And therefore I needed to be immediately pushed down and punished and cast out of this sort of system of beliefs. And yeah, it was pretty wild. Like, so, I mean, it's indicative of another just major challenge in our discipline anyways, which is anyone who is not a straight white man is made to feel as though they don't belong. So much so that people who aren't even in the discipline feel ownership over the discipline, and who aren't even involved in it feel like they are allowed to. And I know gatekeeping gets thrown around a lot as like a phrase, but this really is, they are allowed to say who gets through and who doesn't. And you don't even have to be a historian to feel like you somehow have rights over the field, because we treat history as something that is for everyone, which it is, which sometimes means everyone feels ownership over who's allowed to practice it or who's allowed to participate in it. And I think, women, and again, anyone who's queer, anyone who's not white, are treated as though they are intruders, that they are sort of enemies at the door of this castle, the ivory tower that exists in history, and are dealt with kind of accordingly. And that's what I felt like was happening. I felt like I was being punished for saying that I was a historian, which I am. Like, it's another one of those things that were like, it's not a question. This isn't something that's up for debate, whether I am or I'm not a historian. If someone walked up to an electrician, like I said, and said, well, you're not an electrician, while they're working on rewiring your house, like, that's not up for a debate. They are an electrician. I am a historian. That's my profession. Sorry. It's pretty, I have a pretty thick skin because of what I work on, but it definitely did reach a point where it was just overwhelming, like the amount of hatred. And I'm not the first person that this kind of thing has happened to in the discipline, and I'm not going to be the last. And it is something that needs to be addressed more. And I think there were also senior historians in the field who I know saw what happened to me and didn't do or say anything about it. And I think that was that felt like a real failure to me. Like, I felt a little bit failed by people who had more power than me in the field and could have said or done something. Not, they couldn't have fixed it, but they could have supported me a little bit, even, I mean, I would get messages from them individually, but nobody wants to put their head above the parapet when that kind of thing is happening. So I would get, private supportive messages and comments and stuff, but it felt like, same as with Daisy, there weren't enough people being willing to say this is horrifying and should not be happening, So those are my thoughts on that. I think it really is indicative of the field as a whole, that this kind of thing can happen.
I think it is, and I think that you touched the nerve there, because I think it's also very indicative of the lack of solidarity that exists within history as a discipline. The humanities in general are extremely competitive fields. Which, I mean, I imagine that in the hard sciences and STEM in general, it happens too. But there tends to be a difference between the approaches and the methodological, the methodological approaches to case studies and research topics, that I think that in the humanities is a bit more prevalent and a bit more obvious because of, well, the human component, right? The human element. But there is a very, very strong lack of solidarity that needs to be torn down. I think that we need to find ways to just, at the risk of sounding Stalinist, to collectivize a bit more, to build stronger communities amongst historians ourselves, amongst those of us, especially among those of us who are minoritized. Because listen, I'm not saying that every male white cis straight historian is bad, of course, but there is a tendency amongst us who are minoritized to sometimes feel like we need to be isolated, like we need to be, because it is a very successful way in which academia ends up tearing us down. we end up believing it ourselves. We end up believing and we end up feeling like if these senior scholars aren't speaking out in your defense, then maybe it's because what's happening to you, maybe you had it coming.
Hmm.
But I appreciate that you don't have that perspective, that you actually feel like those people should have been that they should have expressed their solidarity to you openly and publicly, because that is the way to move forward from these things. That is the way to confront these things happening to us minoritized people, to us queer people, to women, to people of color, to just everybody in the discipline that has the potential to contribute so much to what we do. Because you said it yourself, like you said that you studied the most the traditional white man part of academia. You're not like a revisionist, feminist, decolonial historian. You study Nazis, um, but you bring your own unique perspective from your own experiences as a minoritized person. You bring your own perspective to a field that would otherwise, or a subfield that would otherwise be entirely dominated or primarily dominated by a very certain specific point of view.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, we talked about this a little bit before in the podcast, but like one of the things that was so baffling to me was this part of the imagined version of myself that they were that this sort of mob was getting mad at, was that I was writing some kind of history that I wasn't writing. Like, she must write feminist queer studies, decolonial,
CRT.
reimagining. Like they just imagined the kind of history I was doing. And it's funny because, while I do have, certain political beliefs that would absolutely clash with theirs, and I'm not shy about them, and I'm very open about them. And while I have those things, the kind of history that I write is so middle of the road in terms of, like, it's not radical, because I write very specific narrative history about rewriting a group of people into our history of the US. Like, I just want us to understand that Holocaust perpetrators lived in the US and this is how they lived here. Like, that's it. I'm not there is no radical, it's not even a controversial topic. It's just making people aware that a group of people lived somewhere. That's it. But the assumption that because I am a part of a group that people don't see traditionally as being historians, which is the joke of me versus Bede, that I am not what people imagine as a historian, even though I am. Um, they see that, and they just assume that therefore I must, if I don't look like Bede, if I'm not Bede, or Daisy's not David Hume or whatever, then therefore the work we are producing must go against Western historical tradition. And it's just not true. Like, I am all for people who do that kind of history. Please do it. We need more of it. I love it. I read it. I'm interested. It's amazing. It's, however, not the kind of history that I specifically write. And there's fact that there can't even be solidarity from with someone who's writing the most just straight down the line normal like traditional history is I found baffling. Like, there should have, like, if you can't even get it for that, like, it's, the discipline needs to look at itself, I think.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm not convinced. Personally, I think that you are actually responsible for all of CRT. Um, you just came up with all of it. I think it's all of it is your fault, and the collapse of Western civilization is also your responsibility.
Beyond all of this, I also write about white men. Like, that's the people I'm talking
No.
about. I'm not even talk. I look at 147 in my dissertation. I look at 147 Holocaust perpetrators, and 2 of them are women. The rest are white men. That's it. I'm not even straying out of bounds of who I'm allowed to write about. And that's the thing that is so baffling. Like who I'm allowed by this group. Like I'm not doing anything different than that. So it didn't matter. It's one of those really, like, I was damned if I did and damned if I didn't. No matter what I did, I would have, by virtue of posting a photo of myself looking nice, that's it. I just look nice, which I don't most of the time. I just happen to be going to an event. By doing that, I was declaring myself, radical revisionist historian, because that is the only possible way I could have gotten a degree. Yeah. That's the only way.
The only way.
A few people also were screenshotting like my bio on the university's website and all kinds of things as like a gotcha. And I was like, man, that says all the papers I've given. That's great. I think that looks like that's an endorsement, if anything.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Yeah. Like, if nothing else, that actually, I think, really proves my point and not yours. Like, I couldn't have won. And I think that's the thing that provides me with a lot of solace. The discipline needs to do better, but there's nothing, I didn't bring it on myself and I couldn't have succeeded. So
absolutely,
whatever the metric was, there was no metric I could have met in order to succeed at what they saw as being the bar. So passing whatever they saw as being the bar. So, okay. It shows a way, the way that history has existed for a very long time as a discipline has led people to believe that it should stay that way and be extraordinarily resistant to changes in the kind of history being written and who is writing it. Like, that's all it really showed me, that even people outside of history, outside of this field, outside of academia, outside of whatever, they feel that strongly about resisting any potential change to it, because it confronts them with the idea that the world might look different than they imagined it to in the past and now. So if that's what I had to be for this, then okay. If that's something that I'm a catalyst for in some tiny minuscule way, sure, that's fine. I mean, the tweet that said I was evidence that the West had fallen was like, you know what?
That is good stuff. That is good stuff.
Happens, I guess that's how it happens, man. I'm sorry. I was just going to a Kaylee for my friend's 30th birthday.
So this is how the world ends.
Honestly, it really was like well, I'm sorry, your world is that fragile that my existence did that much damage to it. But if that's the case, then maybe you need to look at what it's built on.
Definitely. Well, Claire, thank you so much for joining me again. Keep being awesome. It's always a pleasure having you.
Thank you for having me, and thank you for letting me rant a little bit. It was cathartic, very cathartic.
Okay, and thank you everyone for joining us, and sorry for our collective ranting, and we will see you on our next episode.
You've been listening to the Ask Historians podcast. Please support us at patreon.com/askhistorians. Find more history like this by following us on Twitter and Facebook, and by visiting us at askhistorians.reddit.com, and ask hundreds of historians and enthusiasts anything you want to know about history.